It was a freezing Friday night in November when Daniel Miller's life changed forever. The kind of night when the wind cuts through your coat and loneliness feels heavier than the cold. He sat alone in a small town diner. His calloused hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee gone cold. Across from him, an empty seat where his little girl Emma used to sit before she fell asleep. At home, wrapped in the same blanket her mother had crocheted before she passed. Daniel was a man worn thin by life. He worked 2 jobs. Construction by day, delivery by night. Sleep was a luxury he could rarely afford. Since his wife's death 3 years ago, every day had been about survival, not living. Yet, despite the exhaustion and emptiness, there was a quiet strength in him, the kind only a parent fighting for their child knows. That night, the diner was unusually full. Families laughing over burgers, couples sharing milkshakes, and the sound of old country music filling the air. Daniel sat in the corner trying not to think about the pile of bills waiting at home or the eviction notice taped to his front door. Then it happened, something that would turn his world upside down. A woman stumbled through the door. She looked out of place. Her elegant dress soaked from the rain. Her makeup smeared, eyes red as though she had been crying for hours. Every head turned, whispers filled the room. She looked lost, scared, fragile. Before anyone could react, a man in a suit stormed in behind her, grabbing her by the arm and shouting something Daniel couldn't quite hear. The woman yanked away, trembling. The man's voice grew louder, angrier. People turned their heads away, not wanting to get involved. But Daniel couldn't just sit there. He'd seen enough pain in his life to recognize someone drowning in it. He stood up, heart pounding. He didn't think, he just acted. If you believe in kindness, courage, and second chances, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share this story, because what happened next will remind you that sometimes one act of compassion can change everything. Daniel stepped between them, his rough hands steady, his voice calm but firm. He asked the man to back off, that the woman didn't seem safe. The man snarled something under his breath about not knowing who he was messing with, but Daniel didn't care. He'd lost too much already to be scared of another bully. The man eventually spat on the floor, cursed, and stormed out into the rain, leaving the woman trembling and speechless. Daniel helped her sit down, offered her his jacket, and asked if she needed help. She whispered a faint thank you, eyes glistening with gratitude and exhaustion. She said her name was Grace, that she just needed a minute to breathe. He didn't cry. He simply ordered her a cup of coffee, and sat nearby until she stopped shaking. That night, after she left in a cab, Daniel thought about her all the way home. He didn't know who she was or what trouble she'd been in, but something about her sadness stayed with him, like looking into a mirror of his own loneliness. The next few days passed in a blur of work and worry. His rent was overdue, his truck was breaking down, and Emma had been asking if Santa would still come this year, even though her dad couldn't afford a tree. Daniel smiled for her sake. But inside, he was running on hope and fumes. Then on the 3rd morning after that night, a black car pulled up outside his small, crumbling duplex. It was sleek, spotless, and completely out of place in his rundown neighborhood. He thought maybe someone was lost, but then the driver stepped out, a tall man in a sharp suit, and asked, "Are you Mr. Daniel Miller?" Daniel nodded cautiously, wiping his hands on his jeans. The driver smiled politely and handed him a small envelope sealed with gold trim. "Miss Grace would like a moment of your time," he said. Daniel blinked in confusion. "Grace from the diner." The man simply nodded, gesturing to the car. "She insists." Against every instinct that screamed, this was crazy. Daniel followed. Inside the car, the seats felt softer than anything he'd ever sat on. They drove through the city, past buildings that reached the clouds until they stopped in front of a mansion that looked like something out of a movie. Grace was there standing by the door, but she looked completely different, poised, confident, glowing. Gone was the frightened woman in the rain. She wore a simple white dress and smiled as if seeing an old friend. "Daniel," she said softly. "I owe you my life." He didn't know what to say. Grace told him that the man from the diner was her ex-fiancé, a manipulative businessman who had been controlling her for years. She had finally walked away. But that night, he followed her, and Daniel's intervention had saved her from something much worse. Daniel just shook his head, embarrassed by the praise. "Anyone would have done the same," he muttered. Grace smiled sadly. "No," she said. They wouldn't have. I've lived in a world where people only help if there's something in it for them. But you helped me without even knowing my name. Then she handed him a check. Daniel's eyes widened. It was enough to pay off his debts 10 times over. But he pushed it back, shaking his head. I didn't do it for money. Grace's eyes softened. I know. That's exactly why I want to help you. Over the next few weeks, Grace became part of Daniel and Emma's lives. She visited often, bringing groceries, toys, and once even a Christmas tree. Emma adored her instantly, and Daniel, though cautious, couldn't deny how her presence filled a void that had been empty for far too long. Slowly, Grace learned about Daniel's struggles. The night shifts, the bills, the guilt he carried for not giving Emma the childhood she deserved. And Daniel learned about her, too, that she was the heiress to a billion-dollar company, that she'd spent years trapped in a life of appearances, craving the simple warmth of genuine people. One snowy evening, Grace invited them both to her home for dinner. Emma's eyes lit up when she saw the grand halls and sparkling lights. Like walking into a fairy tale, Grace made sure they felt comfortable, not like guests, but family. And for the first time in years, Daniel laughed without forcing it. But as the weeks went by, Daniel started to worry. He didn't want to depend on her generosity. He'd been poor his whole life, but he'd always had his pride. One night, as they stood by the fireplace after Emma had fallen asleep on the couch, he told Grace he couldn't keep accepting her help. Grace looked at him for a long time before speaking. Then let me help you in another way, she said quietly. I have a position open at my company. It's honest work and you'd be perfect for it. Daniel hesitated, but she wasn't offering charity. She was offering trust. So, he accepted. Months passed and Daniel's life slowly transformed. He became the maintenance manager at Grace's company, earning a steady income, enough to move Emma into a better school and a safer home. Every morning, she hugged him tight before school, saying, "You're my hero, Daddy." And each time, he thought about that rainy night, when a small act of courage had changed everything. But it wasn't just his life that changed. Grace changed, too. The woman who had once lived behind walls of wealth and loneliness began to find meaning. Again, in simple things, helping at Emma's school, cooking dinner, laughing without fear. Then one evening, Daniel found her sitting alone on a park bench, staring at the city lights. He sat beside her, both quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "You know, Daniel, the night you saved me, I thought my life was over. But you reminded me that there's still goodness in the world. You gave me back something I'd lost hope." He smiled faintly. "And you gave me something I didn't think I'd ever find again. Peace." Grace turned to him, her eyes shining. And for a moment, the world stood still. From that night on, they were no longer just two broken souls who had crossed paths. They became a family. Grace moved into their small house. "Despite owning a mansion, this feels more like home," she'd said. And when Emma called her mom for the first time, Grace cried silently, holding her tight. A year later, Daniel stood on the same spot outside that old diner, now renovated and bustling. He looked up at the neon lights and smiled, remembering how one ordinary night had rewritten his destiny. He wasn't rich in money, but he was rich in ways that mattered: love, family, and gratitude. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Stories like these remind us that kindness still exists, that miracles often come disguised as small acts of bravery. And before you go, tell us in the comments, do you believe that one good deed can truly change a life? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Because Daniel's story reminds us of one simple truth. Sometimes when life feels darkest, all it takes is one moment of compassion to bring the light back. And maybe, just maybe, to save not one but two souls at once.